Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back in the studio. It's nice to have you in the stream. So thanks for this opening. Thanks for the G20 Sherpa panel. Let's continue into our day with the opening plenary about the great realignment for a better future. And I hand over to my colleague Declan Curry, who's opening this panel.
Well, thank you very much. And hello, everybody, and welcome to this open plenary discussion for the 2021 Global Solutions Summit. I'm Declan Curry. I've been a TV and radio journalist focused on business and the economy for nearly 3 decades, and I've been working with Global Solutions and its various incarnations for more than a decade. Our theme today is the Great Realignment for a Better Future. We will discuss this over the next 45 minutes with Karen James of Environmental Resources Management. That's a global provider of environmental and sustainability related services. She is the Group Chief Executive. With Paolo Magri, the National Coordinator and Chair of the T20 Italy. He is also Executive Vice President of the Italian think tank, the Institute for International Political Studies, IPSI. Bob Moritz of PwC International, the Global Professional Services Network and one of the world's big 4 accountancy firms. He's the chair. And Dennis Snower, who is the president of the Global Solutions Initiative. You're also welcome to take part in the debate and to join the discussion. You can do that on social media using the summit hashtags. They are GSS2021 or hashtag Global Solutions. And you can also take part using the chat function on your screen. So let's start by shaping our understanding of the issues. The COVID-19 pandemic has put a spotlight on how interdependent the world is. It has magnified its inequalities and shown how urgent action is required. And you'll have heard already today Professor Snower setting out his case for a great realignment. Paolo Magri, if I can start our discussion with you. Welcome. Italy is, of course, G20 president this year. How does Italy's presidency of the G20 capture the spirit of the great realignment through its 3 Ps, people, planet, and prosperity?
Thanks, Declan, and thanks to GSI for this event. Italy G20 agenda embraces the concept of realignment with its, as you said, its 3 Ps, people, planet, and prosperity. But what does realignment mean for people, planet, and prosperity? For the people, it means first acknowledging that access to healthcare and pandemic prevention is not only a matter of national policies, but a global public good. Second, it means that social cohesion, education, and work and jobs are a structural global problem which cannot be solved by single states, not even the most powerful and rich ones. In the G20, we are quite far from this full recognition, with action often limited to the exchange of best practice or little more. What does realignment mean for planet? It means to move from a little bit, as much as possible, from solemn declaration on carbon neutrality by political leaders to concrete steps to curb CO2 emission over the next years, with the focus on energy transition and taking care of the earth and maritime biodiversity. Second, it means that the fight against climate change should be seen as an opportunity for a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient growth, as a fast move towards deep green transition by using new green financial instruments, by investing in education and training, and by revising welfare system. Then, my last point, realignment on the 3rd P, on prosperity, means that future prosperity cannot be measured anymore only in terms of GDP growth. I know this is a topic very close to Dennis Snower. Or in other words, that GDP growth in the future will not be sustainable if challenges on people and planet, the previous 2P, are not fully addressed. But realignment on prosperity also means that trade needs to be kept open, while more efforts are needed to make it fairer, particularly for SMEs and through a better coordination on taxation. 2 points at the center of the Italian G20. Finally, finance. Escaping the fate of new financial crisis is crucial. The G20 has already demonstrated in the last financial crisis that it can make the difference, especially to strengthen international finance, and the same should be expected, hopefully, from the Italian G20.
Paolo Magri, thank you. We'll explore some of the issues that you have identified during the course of this conversation. Bob Moritz, let me bring you into our discussion. You've been part of Global Solutions for many years now, and you've spoken in the past about the need for recoupling. There seems to be a greater urgency now in that discussion post-pandemic. It's almost as if it sent us a signal saying, get a move on.
Absolutely. Declan, thank you for having me, and thank you to the audience for participating. Let me pick up where Paolo went. First, it's clear that the link between economic growth and positive, sustained outcomes that are good for society has been frayed or diluted. The traditional measures of GDP, as Paolo said, or net income from a business perspective, are no longer indicative of the societal progress that is needed. As you said, Declan, what the pandemic has done, as we all know, is accelerate and put on steroids all of the many trends that we've seen previously and brought them to a head. So what's changed? First and foremost, the world needs to become more evident. We can talk to the SDGs, we can talk to the various topics that Paolo had talked through in his opening comments. But the other side of the equation is we've got much more transparency so that the world, powered through technology, social media, whatever the case may be, now becomes judge and jury. They expect more, they demand more, and they are the world's judge now in terms of, are we making progress? As a result of that, the demands coming from stakeholders have never been more important, more evident, and more impactful. And they have the opportunity to be more of an activist than ever before, demanding that impact. And governments and business have to come together to respond. Historically, we've talked about this concept of activism in the form of investor activism. Well, today we see much more employee activism, consumer activism, societal activism, demanding the change that is necessary. And as you said, the clock is ticking, time is running out, and we've got to respond more holistically because the entire design of the system needs a change. And we'll get into that in a few more minutes.
Bob, thank you. You talk about the importance of activism. It's worth noting that only last night we saw 2 activist directors voted on to the board of the global oil giant Exxon to pursue an agenda towards climate change. Yesterday, a day for radical change for the oil industry. Cara James, we heard Paolo Magri there identify climate change as one of the key issues on which progress needs to be made, in which realignment needs to occur. You are an advisor, you help provide environmental and sustainably related services. What's your perspective on this?
Look, I couldn't agree more actually with Paolo and Bob on this. I think there is a fundamental shift required in terms of how we think about capital. Paolo talked about not only thinking about it in terms of GDP, and we have to be thinking about all forms of capital and the way in which we value and consider and evaluate those forms of capital in our decision making. And so to date, the overwhelming emphasis has been on the value and the consideration of financial capital or economic capital. And I think we need to realign ourselves to be also considering important factors around natural and human capital, social capital, in particular, I think in relation to the climate emergency and the need to deliver net zero by 2050, which is actually faster than Paris. It's not in line with Paris, it's actually faster. than Paris. And then the second one, I think, is around the way in which we value nature. Again, Paolo talked about both the marine and the terrestrial environment. But if we don't start seeking to value nature in the same way that we value financial and economic capital, and we ignore the loss of biodiversity, both marine and terrestrial biodiversity, that will be to our peril. The global pandemic should be a reminder to us all what happens when we destroy nature to such an extent that animals and humans come into such close contact that we create these viruses. And there's a steady stream of viruses stacked up behind this one, to challenge us. And then I think the third one around sort of human and social capital. And again, Paolo mentioned this, and I think, really thinking about equality and inclusion in its broadest possible sense, and how we consider human and social capital in our decision making is, again, I think, part of this great realignment that we need to see.
Thank you very much. Professor Dennis Snower, you've spoken at many incarnations of global solutions about the need for realignment. Hearing what Paolo Magri has said about the agenda of the G20, hearing what Karen and Bob Moritz have said about action in business and the urgency behind it, what are your thoughts?
I think it's time to get real. And I'm absolutely heartened by what we've heard so far. We have leaders in business, we have leaders in academia and in policymaking calling for just that. At a time when populist pressures, inward-looking nationalisms are still very strong. So what do we make of these interesting cross-currents? So I think we should return very seriously to what Karen has told us, these different types of capital: economic capital, social capital, and environmental capital, and think carefully about what it means to embody that in our decision-making processes. Let's start with business. There's been lots of talk about business moving from shareholder value to stakeholder value. And this is indeed extremely important, and Bob has helped us understand why this full significance of this. But let's be clear about one thing. If we want to solve problems such as climate change, regional disparities, the chasm between rich and poor, stakeholder capitalism will not be sufficient. Because if a business emits X tons of CO2, it'll hurt a whole lot of people all over the world that are not the stakeholders of the business. Now, business cannot be expected to have significant regard for those who are not its stakeholders, especially if its stakeholders are not sufficiently mindful of these other interests. Therefore, we need a cooperation at a high level, as Bob has said, between governments and business. So, for example, governments can do three things. They can set legal obligations. That is, if business does not pursue a social and environmental purpose, then its license to operate is called into question. If they can set targets like net zero emissions, and they can have incentives, taxes and subsidies, government procurement, and so on. These are important instruments. And if government acts together with business to align itself, then business can do what it's best, which is pursue its goals efficiently and resiliently, taking due regard of shareholder and stakeholder value, and through its interaction with government, become confident that it will take into account societal value as well. But the ultimate goal must be societal value, and therefore we need this cooperation across government, business, and civil society to get there. And I think one thing that we are doing here and now is helping to change social norms and values, make the values of social capital and natural capital more salient so that more stakeholders will take them seriously into account, but also bring government officials on board together with business leaders to capture exactly this spirit that we've seen here.
Okay, Dennis Snower, thank you. Bob Moritz, let me bring you straight in on this. In terms of changing what business does, changing the purpose of business, how do you take what Dennis said and have it deliver that change on the ground?
I agree with just about everything that Dennis said. The entire system needs to change, not just the business side of the equation. But let's talk specifically about what the business community needs to be focused on. First, there's a time horizon question. We've got to make sure that they understand the concepts of how long they have to have desired impact to get to the trust and sustained outcome that they are looking for. We can't wait. To your point opening, Declan, the time is now. Second, as you look at their development of strategy, you've got to bring that societal viewpoint into the equation. But equally and perhaps more important is to actually change the incentives for changed behavior. The incentives for changed behavior is a very senior management issue, a board issue, and the like, in terms of what are we going to measure to define success, to get to the sustained outcomes that they and the world needs. In that regard, the other thing that needs to change is a reflection of the demands of the consumers. And the consumers here is in multiple stakeholders. It rests in your traditional definition of consumer. It also goes to your investor base as consumers of information and perhaps deployment of capital, which Karen and others have talked about. The good news here is the investing base is asking these questions. Analyst communities, investor calls, and the like, you're typically in the first 5 questions when you are getting into a question on climate, when you're getting into a question on diversity and inclusion, you're getting into questions on what you're doing around nature and the like. So that's great news. The last piece that's got to change is actually they need to be more prescriptive and proactive with the narrative of what they're doing and why they're doing it. To Dennis's point, which I agree with, you've got to actually make sure they're taking the decisions. The problem is many of those stakeholders' demands are in conflict with one another. You're not going to be able to satisfy all of them. So you have to do a much better job in describing the what as well as the why and owning that narrative proactively.
Bob, what about Dennis's point that this is wider than stakeholders, that there are those across the planet who are not direct stakeholders of a business, but are affected by its actions nonetheless? How are they included in this conversation?
Look, I agree with what Dennis said, but the reality is I think we're splitting hairs here. When I describe stakeholders, it's even the individuals that live in the local communities that are impacted by whatever business decision has been made, even though they might not be an employee of that company, they might not be a consumer of that company. Everyone in the world is a stakeholder when you look at the implications of some of these major things that Paolo, Karen, and Dennis have talked about. So stakeholder is not those that have a direct vested interest in that company. It's everybody that might be impacted by that company in some way, shape, or form.
Okay, Karen, James, what we're talking about here are removing the barriers to change and modifying the incentives so that the right change is delivered.
Absolutely, Declan. I couldn't agree more. And I think that, you know, that requires, as Bob has rightly pointed out, I think a complete sort of reevaluation by business of how it thinks about this. And I'll probably pick up on a couple of things in addition to what Bob has pointed out. I think one of the things that needs a revisit by most companies is this question of purpose. You know, what is my purpose? And I know that some of Bob's colleagues, Colin Kelly in particular, have done a lot of work on purpose. And I think for a company to step back and say, in this new context that we're operating in, where my primary purpose is not just to produce economic value, my purpose is to deliver better societal outcomes, what does that mean for my purpose as an entity? And I think you rightly pointed out at the beginning, some of the very significant challenges that have been put in place right in front of Shell, Exxon, and Chevron, all three of them this week, in terms of what is their fundamental purpose. So I think sort of really thinking hard about purpose, I think, is key. I think Bob mentioned timeframe and pace. I think there's also another dimension to this, which is the way in which we think about the long-term horizon. So, we're so sort of trained to think about short-term returns to shareholders as opposed to what is the long-term impact on all stakeholders. And that's a complete mindset shift that, again, we need to incentivize. What are the timeframes over which executives are incentivized? What are the timeframes in which strategy and actions are required to be implemented? And then the third thing, which is where we spend most of our time talking to our clients, it's not only the what and the why, it's the how. How do I operationalize this in my organization? How do I embed it? And that means, the incentives for executives, but I think it also means both, sort of financial and other incentives for staff throughout the organization to really take action and make it very clear for people what it is that needs to be achieved over what horizon, and recognize that some of this change will take longer than just next year's returns and dividends to shareholders.
Thank you very much. Paolo Magri, let me bring you back into the conversation, because I'm interested in how you see the decisions made by business, also the influence of business in society, how that feeds into the agenda for the G20, and also addressing this question from Laura Bashu from the Czech Republic, who's watching us, stating that big business shapes the position of many smaller countries. When you talk about realignment, how is that taken into account in any governmental decision makings? Paolo Magri.
Yeah, I fully agree with what Karin and Bob said. And I think that one of the crucial issue is not only, as mentioned, the how and when things are implemented, but to reach easily and quickly the when, we need to get everybody on board. And to get everybody on board means, for example, in the T20 exercise, which, as you may know, is structured with different engagement groups, think tanks, foundation, youth, women, and business, is try to work together and not in parallel as in the past, because most of the issues that Bob and Karin mentioned are issues in which business leaders play a role which is as important as the role of government or civil society. So this is crucial. And then the second issue you raised with the question from the Czech Republic is it's the second need of inclusion, which is needed in our exercise. I mean, we keep talking the global solution and the Italian T20 of the G20 countries. But we all know that whatever issue we discuss, be it climate change, be it vaccine distribution, be it trade or financial architecture, the role of the rest of the world, let me use that term, is crucial. So the format does not include that part of the world, but whatever topic we discuss, the role of this country comes up. So the effort is to be at the same time focused on the stakeholder. Let me use the term you have been using so far, so long in the previous comment. We have to keep in mind our stakeholders, and the stakeholder of this exercise are the G20 countries. At the end of the day, we have to go to them and say, these are possible solutions to the problem. But at the same time, we have to keep an eye open and an open dialogue with the rest of the world. And we have been trying to do that. It's always difficult, as the G20 head of state try to do that. I think we need more on that issue, keeping the ownership of the big 20 countries, but having a clear attention to the rest of the other stakeholders. Let me use that term.
Dennis Snower, just on that point, when we talk about a great realignment, do we hear enough of the voice of the global south, of smaller nations around the world, or is the discussion dominated by the big 20 countries and big multinational organizations?
I mean, currently the discussion is indeed dominated by the powerful and wealthy and so forth, because they have the resources to project their voices. At the same time, there is a groundswell of opinion around the world that is often unhelpfully manifested itself in terms of protests against globalization and automation and so forth. And it is our joint responsibility to pull societies together. So what does this mean in terms of Karen's how? I would suggest that if we've agreed that we need to change our governance systems, our incentives, and so forth, then the next big challenge would be to agree on how this stuff is to be measured. So with regard to environmental sustainability, we've made very significant progress. Carbon emissions, even in terms of biodiversity, we've done a lot. In terms of social capital, we still have a long way to go. And I would propose that we keep it simple and we make sure that people can, and companies and government performance can be measured across the board by a common index, just like GDP is measured across countries. And therefore, I'd like to mention two really important normative values that can be measured that are important to people across nations and across cultures. One is solidarity, social embeddedness. That can be measured both objectively and subjectively in a variety of ways. And the other is personal empowerment, agency, the ability to shape your own fate through your own efforts. That too can be measured in a variety of ways. And once we have business performance and government performance, also the performance of civil society measured in terms of not only shareholder value and GDP, but also solidarity and agency and environmental sustainability, then we're on the right track. And that will also help develop a sensitivity for what is truly important, what we recognize as truly important, particularly now in the aftermath of the pandemic. So I would suggest we focus on SAGE, S-A-G-E, solidarity, agency, material gain, and environmental sustainability, and try to combine our efforts to move in a direction so that the measurement of business performance, government performance, also civil society will do adequately across this entire dashboard.
And other global organizations have also stressed the importance of what you measure and measuring it properly. The OECD during this summit will talk about its great global dashboard as well. And Bob Moritz, of course, when you look at business, what you measure determines what gets done.
For sure, Declan. And to pick up where Dennis left off, what is now needed is a set of common standards where the world, public, private, government, and business, all of the above, can report so the world can measure progress and comparability. And that is what is extremely important as we move away from, like I said at the start of my comments, the singular focus on just a net income or the strength of a balance sheet. Now, the challenge is everybody has a different point of view, or what are those right measures? And we've got an alphabet soup of organizations that are putting out thesis, proposals, and the like. The good news here is a couple of data points for us all, to take a half full mentality for a moment. First, you've got a business community that actually agrees with this concept. In our recent PwC CEO survey that we launch each year, 5,000 CEOs identified, 65% of them say we've got to measure more and we should be reporting publicly more so in non-financial measures. The second thing, you've got international accounting standards bodies that are now coming together to focus on sustainability standards. First time ever. And there is a belief by the various regulators around the world, the various governments around the world, to drive in that direction. The hope here is to get to a singular set of standards, not one that is fractured and fragmented, because we'll have confusion amongst the stakeholder group, the society at large, in terms of how to compare and how to contrast. Last but not least, even the capitalists, i.e. the investor base, wants this. They need to make better decisions in terms of how to deploy their capital to get to better results. They're looking for that. One of the big issues that we just talked about a few weeks ago as a group of CEOs in this space was the fact that we're worried about the public companies having these rules and responsibilities, but the privates won't. We'll have arbitrage as a result of it. So the good news here is you have a lot of momentum moving towards where Dennis went. The challenge is to make sure that we take a holistic view on what gets measured and do that consistently around the world so the world can measure that progress and compare organizations and or countries as necessary.
Okay, thank you. Karen James, Dennis mentioned the role of government in its interaction with business in terms of setting a framework, setting a timetable for action. From your perspective, in your role in advising companies around the world, what does business need from government?
To me, this is just such an important part of the equation, Declan, and I think often forgotten. I think there's an assumption that business, because it's full of smart people and people are very interested in delivering a return on their investment, that somehow the markets will just sort it out. And the reality is that hasn't happened, because look where we are, and it won't happen at the pace that we need. So I think from my point of view, I think there are three things that we need. One is just the leadership that goes with establishing strong government policy and direction. And I think in many places, including my home of birth, Australia, this is just sadly lacking. And I think that absence of leadership on these issues, which are so stark, I think creates a great deal of uncertainty for business. And if there's one thing that business needs more than anything else, it is some certainty in the policy landscape so that they can make these long-term decisions about where to deploy capital. Because for many of them, the question around deployment of capital is not just something you do in 12 months. It's capital that you're delivering a return on for 5 years, 10 years, even longer. And then I think the third thing is the framework that actually Dennis talked about earlier, which is the legal framework, the targets and the incentives, which really support that certainty. So for me, I think the certainty is the biggest thing. And that comes from the things that Dennis talked about, but it's also the leadership, being prepared to stand up and say, we will establish a strong policy on energy. We will establish a position on net zero, because that creates the framework in which business can make its decisions and make the appropriate, allocation of capital to support those decisions.
Karen, the question is when. Let me put to you a question from Manli Sethi at Bocconi University. How much time is it going to take to come up with a uniform system across developed and developing countries to measure the type of value that we're trying to create? In short, this question is saying, aren't we running out of time?
We are. We absolutely are running out of time. I think there is no question. And probably 12 months ago, I was despairing. I am very much encouraged by the change that has taken place in the US. I think the change in the administration in the US, and I think the leadership that is being demonstrated by the current president and the administration is incredibly positive, and the support for the low carbon agenda and climate change policy in general, including support, I think, of the TCFD, is very encouraging. On the flip side of the scale, I think, despite seeing some very positive commitments from China, I still have real concerns about the pace of emissions, in not just China but also places like Australia, which are just failing to come up to any kind of measure. So I don't despair as much as I did a year ago, but I think we are running out of time, Declan, no question, and we need leadership from government as well as from business.
If I can, Declan.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can, just to pick on the specific question. To Karen's point, I have been tremendously positively impressed by the momentum that is built over the last 12 months and the actions that have been taken, such that I think you're going to get to some level of requirements for reporting to measure and determine the progress over the next 12 to 18 months. And I put that on the table based upon what I've seen, what I've heard, and what I've been engaged in, and many of us on the panel are a part of that process. I think the challenge is, how do we actually get the outcomes regardless of what that measurement system? And that's to Karen's point in terms of that's where we need the leadership. I want to go back to one other point that Karen talked about, which is what do we need for government and business? We need them actually to work together. Yeah. We need them to actually learn from one another, listen to one another, engage with another, and work together to actually get this. And that's an element of the leadership that Karen talked about that is extremely important in terms of us making the progress. And that's why this particular forum is great to get that conversation going. And Paulo, the G20 is another element of that as we come together and move this ball forward.
Paulo Magri, your thoughts on this? Are we running out of time? Is the G20, does it have the structure, the ability to engineer the international collaboration that we all are saying is needed?
Let me first say that I share the half-full glass approach that was mentioned in previous interventions by Bob and Karen. We are seeing good signals in different areas. And I agree, the business sector is moving fast. What we are hearing, listening, and reading in the last 12 months was impossible to consider a few years ago. Having said that, we have also to consider that while we had positive signals, we are experiencing a deteriorated situation on many issues. The economic side, still the health side, unemployment, inequality, poverty, and so on. So we are moving forward, but we have a large challenge in front of us. Now, your question, will the G20 make a difference? Hopefully, meaning that it's clearly an opportunity to put together all these issues at the same time with important leaders, some of them recently changed and has been a positive signal, and go through them and try to realign, let's go back to the topic of our conversation, realign the problems, the challenge, realign the 3 Ps. Can we expect a resolution of these issues? Most likely no. We have learned through different G20s that it's a process. We start talking of something and then it looks like a bizarre idea, like energy, the green transition 20 or 15 years ago for many business leaders. So you start talking, you have at the beginning diverging views, and then you move to the next G20 and it gains momentum and priority. We have, and let me take the last minute on this, we clearly have, having in mind it's a process, urgent issue to solve. And the one urgent issue is clearly still the pandemic and the vaccine. Distribution is clearly unequal, And we cannot talk about rebuilding better our society if we don't stop distraction. We cannot talk about realignment if we still have disalignment on health issue. And health disalignment means economic disalignment. So this is one crucial issue. The second urgency, and I go back to the when that Karin mentioned, is to move from announcement for 2050, 2040 into concrete plans and steps. Karin mentioned what it means for different companies to implement, and the same would apply for society, for institution, moving from announcement to specific steps. So, and this I would say is the second priority. And let me mention the third one is to move a little bit forward on social cohesion, which, as I said, it's clearly in each state responsibility, but we need to find out some way to exercise the solidarity which Dennis mentioned before, and to work together. We all mentioned working together also on issues which in the past were clearly within the responsibility of each state.
Paolo Magri, thank you. We only have about a minute or so left on this discussion, so let me ask you this. I understand you say that the G20 is a process. Is it enough of a success this year that you don't go backwards, that just standing still is regarded as a success?
I'm more ambitious than that. I'm more ambitious. We have to be more ambitious than that. We cannot be stupid. We cannot expect on the hundreds of topics that are in the agenda to move forward, but we have to move forward even 200 meters, 300 meters, half a mile, that's fine, but not just stand at in the position we were in the past. It would not be accepted by people in the world, which are our stakeholders, by the way.
Paolo Magri, thank you very much. I know that all of you will want to join me in thanking our panelists for this opening plenary discussion. They were Karin James of Environmental Resources Management, Paolo Magri, who's the National Coordinator and Chair for the T20 in Italy and also is with ISPI, Bob Moritz of PwC, and Dennis Snower of the Global Solutions Initiative. I'm Declan Curry. I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank you for your questions and your conversation whilst this discussion has also been taking place. Remember, you can continue the debate on social media using our hashtags Global Solutions or hashtag GSS2021. Please do stay with us for continuing discussions here at Global Solutions.
Thank you so much, Declan. Thank you. And welcome back in the studio, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back in the Global Solutions Conference studio. I just want to give you a quick outlook of what's coming up, because now there are several streams starting now. Of course, I'm happy if you stay with us in the main stream here in the studio, but I do understand if you switch to one of the other channels, for example, the Salon, Forum 1, Forum 2, or Forum 3. There are plenty of topics covered there, so we can't wait to continue to discuss with you in the several streams. But now I just, looking forward with you to the upcoming session. Before, I just wanted to give you again the idea of networking. I know we all miss to come together personally. I hope that will come back very, very soon. We all do. And we do miss you here, of course, in the conference scene. But nevertheless, we do have some network opportunities. On the top of the stream, you will find Summit Lounge and Networking. So this is the place where you can gather and you continue the discussion. All day long, there will be the Young Global Changer area. So this is the place where you can get into the discussion with the young global changers. They are in the room, they take you, and of course they gonna start a debate with you if you like. All day long as well is the Summit Canteen. That's the place where you'll find the breakout sessions. So this is also a place of coming together and continuing continuing the debate. And during the panels and the debates, of course, as you already listened to, is the session chat. So this is also the place to continue the debate while the debate on scene and on set will taking place. So the chat moderators will also lead you the way, and they will send you some links now and there in the chat, so just follow the links. Last but not least, my favorite networking opportunity here at the Global Solutions Summit is what? Yes, you can send private messages to everybody, to every registered participant. So it's like a text message to every participant that is registered here at the Global Solutions family. If you don't believe me, just try to ping me and just try to send me a message, and I will respond as soon as possible. I think this is a brilliant idea to really network on the next level. As I said, we're going to head into our little break, 15-minute break. So I'll see you back at 2 p.m. But of course, I'd like to announce the next panel that's coming up, covering the topic of the pandemic preparedness as a global challenge. So the question really remains, what are the lessons from COVID-19? We will listen to a keynote by German Federal Minister of Health, Jens Spahn. So I promise you, as always, a lot is coming up. And I see you after the break.